Professor Siegel, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
I wanted to start off by asking you a little bit about your motivation, perhaps. Was there a moment in your early life or in your studies when you thought, yeah, this is what I want to spend the rest of my career focusing on? Why is indoor air quality of supreme importance for you?
It's a great question. And I think, like a lot of people, I would have to say that I at least partially stumbled into it more than anything else. So basically, when I was going to university, I was interested in environmental issues broadly. And in my early years in university, I was interested in both energy and in water. And one of my first kind of real summer jobs was at an organization called the Grassroots Alliance for Solar Pennsylvania, which their name is and was a misnomer. But what we did that summer was did measurements of indoor air quality and energy use in Philadelphia row houses. That got me really interested more in buildings and how buildings work. And it was mostly from an energy perspective, actually, that I was interested. And then I got into my master's degree and I was studying energy use in buildings. And I started to see a little bit more about indoor air quality. And one of the things I realized is there was lots of people studying energy and really few people studying indoor air quality. And the problems were all really interesting. It is like the Wild West. Everything's unexplored. We don't even know sometimes what questions to ask. And that was really interesting and exciting to me. I guess early in my career, I did, let's say, a little bit of energy work, but mostly indoor air quality work. And for the past, let's say, 20 years, it's been all indoor air quality.
Yeah, and you mentioned the people who are living in, I think the word you used is row houses. So I
Yeah.
assume this is some form of public housing.
Some of it was just the typical housing stock. So if you've been to Philadelphia, it's a lot of three-story homes where they're attached on both sides, unless you happen to be on an end unit. From a building science perspective, they're very interesting because we share air with our
Hmm.
neighbors in
Hmm.
attached buildings. And I think
Hmm.
we'll probably get into some of those issues. But I think that one of the things that we learn, I'm fundamentally a building scientist at heart. But one of the interesting things about indoor air quality in buildings is that you have to really understand the building, but you also have to really understand the neighboring buildings and the neighboring
Hmm.
spaces and how they connect.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it because it's the shared air that is often a problem for folks with.
Absolutely.
And did you have in those early years empathy for folks? Was it like a left brain, right brain thing, perhaps, where you thought, yeah, there's a lot of people who are struggling here, and I want to focus in my science in ways to help people?
Yeah, I think that there's certainly a strong element of that in my work, but I think that also, like, coupled with that, there is this really important issue of traditionally people who study indoor air don't come from a buildings perspective.
Hmm.
And so what I was seeing a lot of was people studying, doing brilliant indoor air quality work, but it was divorced from the context in which it exists.
Hmm.
And so many of the problems when I talked to people that they were having were because of the building.
Hmm.
And so I felt like there was a really interesting opportunity here to
Hmm.
take knowledge of buildings, which is a relatively well developed science in a lot of the world, and then couple that with indoor air quality and really understand, like, really be able to come up with solutions that actually worked for people.
Hmm. Let's talk about multiple chemical sensitivity for a second, because this is the multiple chemical sensitivity podcast. I know you're not an expert in MCS,
Uh-huh.
but there's a lot of denialism, and you mentioned physicians before we were talking on the record. Sometimes we're dismissed. Knowing the potency of chemicals, the harms that they cause, do you think it's plausible that people react in the multiple severe ways that we do to chemicals, and that it is really important that we address these?
Yeah, so of course, it's not only plausible, it's quite likely. But the other piece that I think is really important to couple that with is just the complexity. These are not simple issues. The very seemingly same environment can have very different concentrations of things at different times. And so you can see a variety of responses that an individual might have in that environment. A lot of times we can't even measure the things that are relevant, not because they're not there, but we just don't have the technology or even know to ask the right questions sometimes.
Hmm.
I think that's really how I see it, is that it's not so much a question of does this exist or not. I understand there is that debate, but I
Hmm.
don't see that as the central from the kind of science point of view. The kind of science point of view is
Hmm.
like, how do we actually understand this in a way that's helpful?
Hmm.
And then the second part of that is sometimes we need good understanding to solve problems, and sometimes we can solve problems with partial understanding. And I
Hmm.
think that, as always, even though I do research for a living and I love to do research, I do think that there is a practical piece here around problem solving that we
Hmm.
don't necessarily need to fully understand the problem
Hmm.
to start talking about solutions.
Yeah. And in my work on this podcast, I talk to a lot of folks who talk about the unknowns of chemicals, consumer products. And
Right.
I think we're going to get into this consumer products, but also building chemicals, right?
Yep,
And now you're
absolutely.
saying there's the same thing is happening with buildings in terms of chemical composition that we don't know what they are, the effects on the human body, cognition, health, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me make one other point that I think is relevant at this point in the conversation. And that is that it's well accepted that we have people in our population who are immunocompromised for one of many reasons, right? And they have to think about what environments they go in and what activities they engage in. And there's no one who's going to debate that is a thing in the population. And I think that that's the other real kind of issue we should be talking about, is that there can be people who have particular responses or sensitivities or other things that are not universal. They can be very individual, or they can affect a relatively small part of the population. So they're not necessarily well understood.
Hmm.
And so I think that one of the things we'll have to get to today is there this concept of a universally safe environment? And I
Hmm.
think the answer to that is I'm not sure that there is. I think that we might start having to think about, in general, what we can do to make environments safe for as much of the population as we can. And then how do we deal with the rest from an equity issue? I think
Hmm.
that should be part of our conversation
Hmm.
as well today.
Yeah, but do you think more people like you might be fielding a lot more emails or calls from folks like you accepted to come on the chemical sensitivity podcast? Do you get a lot of these calls? Because we know that I think in the US it's 15 to 37% of the population self-report some level of multiple chemical sensitivity. So we're dealing with a growing number of people, millions of people around the world. I just spoke with someone in Norway yesterday who said it's 1 in 3 or 1 in 5 in Scandinavia. These are not insignificant numbers. And when you think about that, do you think it's because the potency or the chemicals in new builds or in homes or mold, or what are you most concerned about, Professor?
Yeah. So I want to respond to something you said first
Yeah.
before I answer your question.
Mm-hmm.
There are many different aspects. And so a
Mm-hmm.
solution that might work for part of that population might not work broadly
Yeah,
across the population.
absolutely. But
And
sometimes,
yeah.
please go ahead.
Yeah. And so I think that's really important too, is that I think it's well accepted that people have personalities and have individual differences and so on. The way that I approach buildings is much the same way. A building
Mm-hmm.
has individual things and it changes over time.
Yeah.
And I think that we really have to be thinking more about solutions that they might work for some, but not for others. And I think we really have to, as a society, start thinking about some of those bigger issues.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Sometimes people talk anecdotally on social media in groups for people with MCS about creating like an intentional community where people might live together or next to one another. And
Right.
often the feedback is that won't work, right? Because person A is going to react to something that person B. So I take your point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. But now let me answer your question. I don't know the answer about what's causing this or what I suspect are major contributors. But what I will say, I think, is probably an important part of the problem is
Mm,
that indoor environments are chemical soups. And they're chemical soups because we get some stuff that comes from outside. We get some stuff that's related to the activities inside. We get some stuff that comes from the building and its contents. And then we get some stuff that comes from the history of that building. I can tell when I go into a building that smoking has occurred a long time ago, even if it hasn't occurred anytime recently. Or I've been in households that don't currently have a pet, but I can tell that someone had a pet there at some time in the past. And there's probably a whole bunch of cues for those sorts of things. Some of them are olfactory, some of them might be other things. And so all of these factors, and you had Nusrat and Brandon on the podcast a little while ago. I listened to their interview and they talked a lot about the chemistry that occurs. This is not static, right? It changes over time and there can be interactions. And so I think that the fundamental issue is we have all of these different contributors that are contributing differently in different buildings at different times. And I wish that there was the kind of smoking gun, so to speak. But I don't think there is. I think it's a whole host of different factors. And I don't want to make it seem like an impossible problem because it's not. But I do think that is a really important concept. There's not a simple cause nor a simple solution.
I absolutely hear you. My wife and I have been recently looking for a new house,
Uh-huh.
found one. But what you're saying completely resonates because every place we go into, olfactory wise, oh yeah, the pets, the carpet, the wallpaper,
Yeah.
the potential of the moisture. And that's the reality that we live with. But I think for folks with MCS, I can't speak for everyone, but fragrance is a big one. And you mentioned shared air. For
Uh-huh.
example, where we live currently, mostly we have to keep the windows closed because people's dryer sheets, scented
Uh-huh.
dryer sheets that they use in their dryers, comes through the dryer vents and pollutes the neighborhood. And I react really strongly to those.
Uh-huh.
So shared air. Do you want to talk about your thoughts on fragrance?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I'm not an expert in fragrance. Fragrances make it to the brain very quickly and have very specific responses. And that's different from a lot of pollutants that I study. Several comments I'll make about fragrances. There is a ton of added fragrances to almost everything that we use, just so many consumer products, personal care products. One of the things we learned in preparing to do some cognitive science research is that fragrances are added to particularly retail environments for a variety of different purposes. And we nominally think that we sometimes have control over our homes, and sometimes that's true to different extents. But fragrances, it's both an artificial and a natural kind of world of fragrances that are out there. So there's the fragrance itself, and then there is the chemistry that happens with fragrance as well. And fragrance is not at all, most of the compounds that make fragrances are likely to participate in chemistry for a variety of reasons. Have fragrances themselves, it might be a different fragrance. Some of them some people are sensitive to them and cause issues. And so there's another layer there as well. And then the third comment I'll make is if you think about, and again, there's experts in this world on what I'm about to say, but I think it's a really important point. If someone is adding a fragrance to something, if that fragrance was very volatile and went away right away, it would have very little benefit, right? Because it would not persist in the air. So we do a lot of things, the chemical industry does a lot of things adding fragrances to make them persist in some things as well. So it's not just a instantaneous thing, it's there and then it's gone. It's designed, like you think about a perfume or a cologne. It's designed to slowly release over time so that you get the effect beyond just when you apply it. And so not only is this an issue of instantaneous exposures, but it can be very persistent.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it. We experience it on a daily basis, right? Laundry products, personal care products.
Mhm.
Yeah. So where do we go from there? You mentioned the cognitive element, right? And I don't think you're talking about cognitive impact for people with MCS. You're talking about the general population, I believe.
Right.
What do you know about the cognitive impact of fragrances?
Okay. So we know very little, but we've been doing some research on it. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we've been doing and why we're doing it and what we know so far. Starting about a little more than a decade ago, there started to be papers in the literature about the cognitive impacts of indoor air quality. The typical study design is you would take individuals, you would put them in a chamber, you would add carbon dioxide to the environment in some manner, And then people would perform some sort of cognitive battery that measured different aspects of cognitive performance. And what some studies, not universally, but what some studies observed is when CO2 was elevated, people would perform worse on cognitive tasks. In about 5 years ago, 2020 or so, team that I was part of, including a graduate student, Bowen Du, a graduate student at the time, wrote a paper where we looked at all of the research on CO2 and cognitive function. And our conclusion was CO2 was not actually the issue. It was something else besides CO2 that was leading. It might co-occur with CO2, but it was something different from CO2. And carbon dioxide, I think we all know about it because of climate change, but just to be very clear, there's very high carbon dioxide on our exhaled breath. That's the main source indoors of carbon dioxide. And it's odorless, it's colorless, it doesn't really have any health effects until you get to amazingly high concentrations that you would never get to in an indoor environment. To my knowledge, I don't know anyone who's sensitive to it, but there might be some who are sensitive to it. I've just never heard of that. Okay, so we said, it's not CO2. What else might it be? And so the first experiment we did was with an essential oil diffuser. An essential oil diffuser is like a small humidifier, ultrasonic humidifier. You put in your water and you put in a few drops of your favorite essential oil, and it fills the space with a bunch of stuff in the air. And pleasurable scent elevates the humidity a little bit, and they're very widely used. I, again, had not, I guess I should have known, but I had never really heard of them before. First came across them in a completely different context, and then we thought, oh, this is a good source to use in these cognitive experiments. And so we did a series of experiments. And by the way, an essential oil will produce a fragrance based on the essential oil that's used in it, but it will also produce a whole lot of particles, very small particles that come from largely minerals in the water that's in the essential oil diffuser. So from our perspective, we said, it's not CO2. Let's try this, what we see as a very large source of indoor air pollution. And so we did an experiment where we had about 60 subjects who were exposed to either a placebo condition, that is essentially a humidifier, but with very pure water in it. And then we had another group of people who we exposed to an essential oil diffuser with different types of essential oil in it. And I'll get to why and the connection to fragrance in a second. And basically, we found that people who were exposed to the essential oil in the essential oil diffuser performed similarly on a lot of cognitive tasks. But one of the things they did is they exhibited more impulsive behavior, which is one of the things you measure in a cognitive battery. So that led to the retail research that I talked about. So one of the reasons that many stores put a fragrance into the air is to make people act more impulsively, which of course translates to spending more money in the retail environment. So fragrances are added for very specific reasons in a lot of environments. Okay. The interesting point I want to make about that research, I think the overall research is interesting and the audience can judge that for themselves. But the specific point about fragrance I want to make is we had two different essential oils. We used a lemon essential oil, which smells like cutting lemons and so on in the space. And we used grapeseed oil. To my nose, I can't detect an odor. Other people have told me that they can. I'm not particularly sensitive to odors, but I really can't tell. And when we tried to measure for VOCs, we didn't see much in the air. But again, every VOC measurement approach has limitations. And so there could have been things in the air that we weren't able to measure with the grapeseed oil. But both the lemon scented oil and the grapeseed oil had the same impact on impulsive decision making that I mentioned. And what we suspect is going on there is that there are things in the air that are happening no matter what the essential oil is that are having this impact on our brain. And I think that this gets at the kind of issues here with that that some individuals might be more or less sensitive to whatever it is in the air that's causing the impact on the brain. It might be there are different things in the air, but there's definitely an effect there. And if you look in the literature, there's all kinds of things about adding fragrance to air, mostly from the perspective of getting people to elicit certain behaviors. And
Mhm.
so we know that those are real. One of the things we did is we gave a survey to people asking about their perception of the environment afterwards. And the really interesting thing to me that I still don't understand from those surveys, I think that many people would say lemon scent is positive. I understand that's not universal or anything, but I think that's why people use lemon scented oil in their essential oil diffuser. But the pleasantness was actually the same, I think even a little bit higher when we used grapeseed oil in the diffuser. We did tell people what was going on in the experiment. So I assume someone with MCS probably would choose not to participate. So we can assume our population was not those with MCS. Even among that population, there is something going on with odor and fragrance that we don't understand.
Interesting. So folks who don't self-report having MCS are still
Right,
reacting to whatever it is
right,
in essential oil.
right.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I want to unpack this a little bit because yes, you chose to talk about essential oil, your study on essential oil, and often people who aren't sufficiently informed say essential oil is a safer alternative to fragrance, but we know it's not. I'm not a
Not at all.
scientist. Do you want to talk about why it's not? What's in
Yeah.
essential oil that's dangerous?
Yeah. So I think in the world, I have come across people who do a lot with fragrance, make perfumes, that sort of thing. And they always draw a distinction in their mind between natural and synthetic products. And to me, natural and synthetic, it's a molecule. And whether that molecule arises because of natural processes or in a factory, it's still a molecule. And so I don't draw that distinction in my mind, but a distinction that I probably draw in my mind that might be because of what I do for a living. When we were doing those experiments, and we do a lot with essential oil diffusers because they turn out to be a really convenient way to make a really dirty indoor environment very rapidly. But the thing I've noticed is that the oils really change quite rapidly over time. And so, first of all, there's not really a ton of regulation, and essential oils aren't really regulated for purity or anything like that. But then, even if we try and use pure chemicals and just from a scientific kind of integrity point of view. But then, even once you open that, you start seeing other things forming. And I'm not saying our results would be true if we used a different essential oil. I'm not sure our results would be true if we use older essential oil rather than new essential oil. But the overall comment is from emissions point of view, how you use an essential oil is really important. So putting it in something that makes it into little particles that go deep into your lung, that is not a good thing from anyone's perspective, let alone someone who is sensitive to those chemicals in question. I think that there are times where people use essential oil on their own skin or on surfaces. And we certainly allow people to do things in their private indoor environments that certainly I can't ever imagine telling someone not to use essential oil in their own private environment. And if they're not sensitive to it, I don't see a big problem with it. But I really get quite nervous when we increase the possibility of exposure to others. And one way to do that is put it in a diffuser.
It's so interesting that you're talking about essential oils. I didn't know that the conversation would go to this place
Mhm,
because for folks like us with MCS,
mhm.
there's so much, right? There's the air fresheners, the paints. You mentioned the chemical soup at the top. Essential oil has always been on my radar and it's on the radar for a lot of people.
Mhm.
Why have you focused on essential oil? Why is it a priority for you or is it? And
Yeah.
what's in it? that is hazardous
Yeah.
to human health?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I'm only going to be able to give you a partial answer. In the world of science, especially the kind of science I do, we need to see big effects to be able to measure them. Research is expensive. If you're trying to go after a relatively small effect, you need much bigger sample size. And let's use the essential oil diffuser. I know that's going to make a ton of particles, a ton of VOCs, depending on what essential oil you use. It's readily available. It's something that is used by people. So it's not like we're studying something that doesn't have a practical application. So that's why I do it. And what about essential oils? That's the part where I don't think I have a good answer, but I think part of the answer is that fundamentally essential oils have compounds in them that are chemically very reactive. So I think a lot of what's going on with essential oil is maybe a little bit related to the oil itself, but I think there's at least a big part of the story that comes from the like chemical reactions that happen. And I'm talking about chemical reactions in the air before someone might breathe it in. I'm talking about chemical reactions that might happen on the skin, as well as chemical reactions within our body. And I think that the fact that essential oils are chemically reactive is probably part of the story.
Really fascinating. But do you also share the concern about laundry products? You mentioned that they're designed, consumer products, personal care products, designed for the chemicals, the scent, the fragrance to last longer. I mentioned dryer sheets, fabric softener. We know,
Right.
for example, in Japan, fabric softener microcapsules are being introduced. I say it often on the podcast because I hear anecdotally that many people are developing MCS because of this. They last a long time. You could ride in the subway, in the trains. You're exposed to it. People walking around become emitters of these chemicals, right? They don't
Yeah.
go away. If someone walks by me in a park where I'm with my children with, I won't say the brand, but certain body spray, I
Mm-hmm.
know it. If I go to
Mm-hmm.
the gym, I know it. It doesn't go away. So
Yeah.
you're talking about essential oils, which is super fascinating.
Mhm.
Professor Siegel, what about the other products? Because in my day to day, I run into the others more frequently, just to
Yeah,
be totally
absolutely.
honest with you. I run into the laundry products, the body sprays, and people listening will have their own kryptonites.
Yeah, yeah,
Essential
absolutely.
oil is a concern, but the soup is also a concern. Do you share the concern about all of these? And maybe what is it about the fragrance that is so dangerous?
Yeah, yes, I share the concern, but I think I share the concern because I'm not an MCS. My concern is it's an uncontrolled experiment, right? There are all these things that are in our environment that we're being exposed to. We know some individuals are more sensitive to these things, some individuals are less sensitive. There's personal variation in sensitivity. And that's not even a subject that anyone is thinking about from a regulatory perspective, for example. And it's essentially the modern study of the indoor environment is not that old. And so we're fundamentally in this situation where there are new chemicals coming in all the time, new fragrances coming in all the time that are being added to the indoor environment. Some of them are quite persistent, as we've talked about. And it's really, I don't say this to be funny, but it's like this constant whack-a-mole where even if a concern is associated with one chemical, it's simply replaced with the next cheapest chemical that has the properties that the individual is after, who's manufacturing, selling the product. And it's this constant game of there's no way we can keep up with the things that are being introduced. So I don't know if it's, oh, there are these particular bad actor chemicals, or if it's the fact that there is just like so many chemicals that some of them are bad actors and they're coming in more and more with all these new products.
Mm.
But to get back to a little bit earlier part of your question, do I have a concern about laundry products and so on? I would say absolutely. I'm sure that people listening to this podcast have, I in general buy unscented products for laundry. I never really understood why people use dryer sheets, for example. So never had a need to use them, not because I'm opposed to them, because I don't see any value in them. But that's a value judgment for sure. But the comment I'll make is that a lot of unscented products that I get and use on the laundry side of things, they're not unscented. They have things in them that I can detect. And like I said, I'm not particularly sensitive. I don't have a sensitive sense of smell compared to others that I know. Fear in this whole world is that there are products being made and sold that are being targeted at those who don't want scents or so on in their environment. And I'm not so sure that people are even able to be protected
Very
as
good
much
point.
as they want.
You mentioned the regulation piece. When it comes to fragrances and consumer products, is it right that corporations aren't required to put on labels to disclose what is in a scented product? And if that's the case, why?
I can't answer why. I can't answer the why question. It would be expensive to do, and people would rather have money than that who are making these products. To my knowledge, there are not regulations. There's a patchwork of voluntary rules. There is some product manufacturers who do make a point to disclose what's in their products. So there's some, but I think that in reality, I'm not because of the chemistry piece of this, what happens after the product and so on. I, I don't even see in my mind an easy path to regulation here. I mean, I think it would be great if every manufacturer of every product was required to list all the ingredients to that product. I can't comment on whether that's feasible or not. I'm not a chemist or in those industries, but I think that would be great. But I also think that would only be a partial solution because of what happens over time and because of chemistry.
Yeah, and that's something that a lot of folks have been on this podcast on. What's the interaction? We don't know how they're interacting. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so the onus becomes ours,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Consumer choices to educate ourselves, to
Mm-hmm.
find out really what is safe, to educate folks in ways that you're doing, right? And others are doing. And maybe the last piece of this conversation could be about protecting ourselves even more. For example, when I step outside, and a lot of people do, I wear a certain kind of mask. So I limit the amount of fragrance that I'm inhaling
Mm-hmm.
if I have to be in outdoor environments and indoor environments. So, do you want to talk about that masking
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps air filtration? I know that's a huge topic,
Uh-huh.
but to most of us, if we can have some kind of air filters, are
Right.
those going to make any difference in terms of indoor air quality?
I love to talk about filters. I'll start by saying that filters in general, as we have used them until very recently, have nothing to do with anyone's health or protecting anyone from anything. They were there to protect the equipment from big pieces of dust and that sort of thing. And so when we talk about filters, it's really important to be specific and to say that filters, we have to be thinking about filters that will work for the things that we're interested in them working for. And at this point, we have a robust filtration industry. There's a variety of solutions, but I would say 95+% of the market is targeted at particles in the air. And particles are very important for people's health, but they are in general not particularly important from a fragrance point of view. So most of the filtration industry, the vast majority of the filtration industry is not necessarily, I would recommend everyone have a filter, either a good central filter, depending on your home, or portable filter in the spaces you spend time. If you want to remove fragrances from indoor air, there's basically one robust technology that's out there, and it doesn't work for everything, and it's called activated carbon. And activated carbon is there's a bunch of ways of making it. For example, it's essentially pyrolyzed coconut shells is one example of where they get activated carbon from. And activated carbon is this fantastic molecule or fantastic structure. It's got like this amazing amount of surface area. So a few grams of activated carbon have the same amount of surface area as like a tennis court, to give you a sense of how much surface. It's got all these little micropores and everything inside of it. So the idea is that if you have things that are in the gas phase that almost all fragrances are associated with in indoor air, and they pass through activated carbon, some of them will be removed to the activated carbon and be removed from the air. Now, it's not for everything. It works better for some types of molecules than others, but certainly if it's a very easy thing to do to get an activated carbon filter. Now, the two comments I'd make from a practical perspective to people about filtration is that one, for activated carbon to work, you have to have a fair amount of it. So a lot of filters that you might buy for particles have a very thin layer of activated carbon. That won't work for very long for removing things from the air, like probably a matter of days or even less. So you really have to get a specialized activated carbon filter, and many air cleaners come with a dedicated, it's often called like a VOC canister or an activated carbon canister that has a lot of activated carbon in it. And that's where people should be going practically on this. And so that's one comment. The other comment about filtration that I think is really important for this community to know is that filters have a fragrance. So some filters have a fragrance because it's added by the manufacturer. Avoid those filters for a variety of reasons. Even a filter that does not have any fragrance added captures all this stuff from the air so that we don't have to breathe it in. And then it sits there as air goes through it. You've got this wonderful site, wonderful from a scientific, not from a personal perspective, for fragrances and chemicals and microbiological activity that can produce fragrances. I'm interested in filters that I say this, you do have to change your filter a lot, your particle filter. And if you do get a good activated carbon filter, the idea is you first filter your particles out of the air, and then if that produces any odors, they have a chance of being captured by the activated carbon. You haven't asked me yet, but I think it's really important to talk about equity issues in all of this. A filter, someone has, let's say, 4 or 5 rooms in their house that they want to protect. Maybe they don't have a central system, or even if they do have a central system, it can't accommodate the kinds of filters they want to use. So you're looking at a portable filter in each of those rooms. And that portable filter has got to have a good amount of activated carbon in it. And so I want to encourage people to, first of all, think about how they are using those filters. For example, an occupancy sensor, so they're only on when someone is present in the room. Many of them have a timer function, or you can add your own timer. So for example, if it's in your bedroom, you could have it come on for an hour or so before you go into your bedroom at night to help clean the air, but it's not operating when you're not in your bedroom for most of the day. So think about that's some of how you extend life. You can also do things like, this sounds a little bit awkward, but people who do it, can get good results from it. You can move an air filter around. During the nighttime, you might have it in your bedroom. And during the daytime, you wheel it into the living room or the dining room. And yes, that's not ideal. People shouldn't have to do that. But that is one way of making the economic pain a little bit less. The third thing, or another thing I'll say about filters and the use of filters for protection, is that we saw during COVID the rise of do-it-yourself filters where people build their own filters. And the idea is you take 4 filters like you would use in a heating and air conditioning system and make a box with them and put a box fan on top. And you have a great filter, actually. That's quite effective and probably quite economical for someone who does want to use activated carbon, is you can buy 2-inch or 4-inch activated carbons that are filters that are meant for buildings, and do that, put a box fan on top, and you have quite a powerful filter that's probably quite effective for removing things from the air, and would be, again, a way. We're still talking hundreds of dollars, but we're not talking thousands of dollars.
Oh, it's very interesting, very helpful. Thank you so much for taking time, for acknowledging this community, and for your support, for sharing your knowledge with us. And I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And can I say one thing in
Yes,
parting here?
please do.
And that is, I've said it a couple of times, but I do think it's the point I always like to end on. And that is, there is this real equity issue across society. And by equity, I mean, I think there's a lot of definitions of equity, and I'm not an expert. But by equity in this context, I am meaning that there is differences in indoor environments that meaningfully impact people. And there is a disparity of impact from exposure to those different environments. There is a disparity of resources to address problems, and there is a disparity of knowledge and even knowing what to do or what issues might be. And so I think that it's really important that we think meaningfully about every individual is going to have a different set of concerns and resources and abilities and access to information to address some of these issues. And I think that it's a very big problem. But speaking specifically about
Hmm.
MCS, I think we really want to think about the things, think about actions that are contributing to reduction of the some of the equity disparities.
Professor Siegel, I really appreciate you mentioning that. And I'll just share that the start of this project, the genesis of this podcast, my aim was to really reach out to all kinds of people and diverse populations. And because in the research, we see that racialized populations, Black people, women, are disproportionately impacted by exposures to toxic chemicals. And quite frankly, I haven't had much success in finding guests to talk about those particular and very important topics that you highlight, as well as listeners. So if anyone's listening and wants to share feedback or suggest a guest, I'm really open to it. And we will continue to take up that task